Hi, I'm David Ritz. I'm the president of the Ocean Reef Community Association, also known as ORCA. I have also been president of the Florida Keys Electric Cooperative, the Florida Keys Aqueduct Authority, the North Key Largo Utility Corporation, and have been involved in a variety of environmental groups over the years. I've been here about 24 years, and I've seen a lot of changes in the last 2 decades. So today we want to talk about water and how water relates to power. So when you talk about water in Florida, you could be talking about anything. Rainwater, which falls to the land and creates lakes and streams, the underground water, the caverns and the aquifers. You could be talking about the oceans, the bays, the reef water. You could be talking about drinking water, reuse water, where you turn sewer water into fresh water, or even water that's used to cool a nuclear power plant. In the paper right now, there's all sorts of water problems in Florida. It's typically too much water or too little water. At the moment, water is pouring out of the east and the west coasts of Florida, affecting Stewart and Fort Myers. They're being desecrated with this polluted water that's leaving Lake Okeechobee and creating havoc in their estuaries with both the plants, the animals, the wildlife, the sea life. And those two communities are absolutely livid about the water situation in Florida. Last year, there was too little water, and here in South Florida, Florida Bay was starved of water, and Florida Bay became too salty because a historic flow of fresh water from Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades down to Florida Bay has ceased to be, and because it got too salty, there was a large seagrass die-off. That seagrass die-off has now come home to roost, and we now have a huge algae bloom in Florida Bay, once again killing a lot of the sea life because of too little water. So how is all of this water related? Well, in Florida, water, every water system is related, whether we start with rainwater coming down to the lakes and streams, to the underground aquifers like the Floridan Aquifer and the Biscayne Aquifer, or whether you're talking about the water on the reef, the water in the bay, drinking water, reuse water, where you turn sewer water into something useful, or reverse osmosis water, where you take the salt out of brackish water and use it for some useful purpose. But all of these water systems are combined, connected, and somehow they're even connected to our power system in Florida. And we'll talk about Turkey Point Power Plant and how it uses water in just a moment. But let's go to the very basics about where our water comes from in Florida. When you look at the Floridan Aquifer, it is a massive underground system of water. It starts up in South Carolina as surface water, lakes and rivers, goes through Georgia, North Florida. It continues to go underground until it gets down to Miami and the Keys, where it's about 1,000 feet underground. And floating above that, just in the southeast portion of Florida, is the Biscayne Aquifer. And the Biscayne Aquifer is pristine, clean water. You could stick a straw in it and drink it right out of the ground. That's where we get most of our drinking water here in the Florida Keys. If you think about it, Florida really is flat. It's almost flat like a table. And there's a slight tilt from Orlando coming down to Florida Bay. So the water historically starts in Orlando, goes down through a series of rivers to Lake Okeechobee, and then in the 16, 17, 1800s, it would then sheet flow through the Everglades until it reached the southern tip of Florida. The problems really started around the 1920s, and that's when a series of canals were built so that commerce could go from the east coast of Florida to the west coast without going down around the tip of Florida. A canal was built from Stewart to the lake, and then from the lake to Fort Myers. And that way, right across the center of the state, barges could take commerce from one side of the coast to the other side. Shortly after that was built, around 1928, a terrific hurricane hit Florida, and it flooded the lake. Lake Okeechobee overflowed its banks, flooding the surrounding communities and killed over 2,500 people. President Hoover said that could never happen again and ordered a dike be built around the lake. And when the dike was completed, that forever changed South Florida. It did a variety of things. It starved the Everglades of water and opened up land south of the lake for agricultural purposes. They drained the swamp and created farmland. And the farmland was used for fruits and vegetables for a period of time, and then eventually converted to sugar. And there's really two large companies that control the sugar in Florida. One is controlled by the Fanjul family, and the other is by the Mott family out of Flint, Michigan. It's the Mott Foundations. And between these two entities, they control a lot of the land south of the lake, and that's where our sugar is grown. The problem is that's exactly the area where most people would like water to be stored. And the only way to store water is to buy the land from the sugar companies so that it can be cleaned, stored, and then eventually sent south like it was during historical times. So those are really the big problems, is too much water or too little water and a lack of storage. I mentioned that the canals were built from Stewart to the lake and from the lake to Fort Myers. Well, once the dam was built around Lake Okeechobee, when the lake began to overflow its banks, the only thing to do was to shoot the water out of these two canals towards Stewart and towards Fort Myers. And that's what's happening in the year 2016. We've had a very wet winter. And because we've had a wet winter, the Army Corps of Engineers was concerned that the dike might give way. And ever since Hurricane Katrina, the Army Corps has been very sensitive about dikes bursting after storms, rightly so. So they send the water right out of the lake, right into the estuaries of Stewart and Fort Myers. And here's a sample photo of the water gushing toward those estuaries. And you can see a distinct line where the polluted water from Lake Okeechobee hits the bay and mixes with the beautiful seawater. You have this exact same thing on both sides of Florida. The problem, of course, is the water in the lake is polluted. So how did it get polluted? Really from two sources. One, in the 1960s to about 1985, the sugar industry would back pump the water from their sugarcane fields back into the lake. They would only do this when their cane fields would get too wet and they needed to dry them out for agricultural purposes. But when they put that water back in the lake, it had herbicides and pesticides and fertilizers, and those pollutants have stayed in the lake. In addition, the water coming from the Orlando area down the Kissimmee River picks up, it goes through a lot of cattle grazing area, picks up a lot of pollutants from the cattle, and also picks up fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides from the agricultural area north of the lake. So the lake becomes this collection area for all of this polluted water. So when the Army Corps has to send the water east and west, there's no time to clean it before it hits those two areas. There's also no time to clean it before they send it south. So that, once again, reinforces the idea of buying land south of the lake. I should mention that when Governor Christ was in office, he did buy a little bit of land south of the lake, and that land has been used to clean the water, store the water, and some of that water just recently has found its way down to Florida Bay. One of the impediments to getting that water to Florida Bay has been Alligator Alley. When Alligator Alley was built, US 41, the roadbed was built on a dike for all intents and purposes, so the road wouldn't flood. Well, that stopped the water north of the road from going south of the road. About 5 years ago, they removed about a mile of the road and put a bridge in. Now the water can go underneath the bridge, and for just a mile, can now go from the north side of the road to the south side. So clearly, another step in the process is to create more bridges so that this water can sheet flow southward. About the year 2000, there was a plan created. It included 68 separate projects to build storage areas, clean the water, remove these impediments, and have the water sheet flow southward. That was an $8 billion plan. It has now risen to $16 billion, and that plan is to be divided half by the state and half by the federal government. Unfortunately, that plan has not been funded. Little pieces have been funded, and just little pieces of these projects have been completed. And until this project is completed, unfortunately, we will be in this position where during times of drought, we'll starve of water, and in times of too much rain, we'll be concerned about flooding. So in summary, in order to solve the water flow problems, the water has to be cleaned. You have to remove all of the impediments to the water flow, which would be the roads and dams and dikes. You'd have to remove the canals so the water can sheet flow. And most importantly, you have to build storage in order to store the water. Now, what does any of this have to do with FPL and the Turkey Point power plant and their cooling canals? Well, the Turkey Point's power plant is really two types of power plant. There's a fossil fuel plant, which uses natural gas, and then there's a nuclear power plant. And both plants essentially do the same thing, and that is they heat water, create steam, the steam turns a turbine, and the turbine generates electricity. Both plants need water to do this. On the nuclear power side, here is a diagram of how it works. The first one on the far left in red is a closed water system, and this water goes around the control rods, the nuclear rods. That water is pressurized to over 500 degrees and simply stays in that loop system. Because it's pressurized, it doesn't boil, and that allows it to get over 120 degrees. That in turn heats the next water system, which creates steam, which turns the turbine. But in order to cool that steam, to turn it back into water to create a closed system, you need a third water system, and that's the water system which are the cooling canals, which is the system that you see when you fly over FPL or simply go by boat. It is a massive cooling canal system that takes the water out of the plant, goes through miles of canals, and then goes back in the plant. The problem occurs when that cooling canal water isn't cool enough, and that's what we experienced last summer. Instead of cooling down as it goes through those miles of canals, it actually stayed hot, and it stayed hot for two reasons. One, there wasn't enough rain to cool it down. The evaporation created more salt in the canals. That created an algae bloom. The algae is dark in color, and that captured the heat and created even a worsening of the problem. So normally you'd want that cooling canal water to be about 100 degrees before it goes back into the plant. And last summer it was about 104. And that some people argued that was too hot. The federal government disagreed. They simply raised the limit to 104 and allowed the plant to continue to operate. One of the concerns is to make sure the cooling canal water is cool enough. And obviously we all want that. No one wants a nuclear power plant to get too hot. So Turkey Point and FPL have been working hard to try to resolve this problem. Their solution is simply to add more water, cooler water, to the cooling canal system, and that would reduce the heat impact. Now, where do you get more water? There is water in the Floridan aquifer, which is, once again, about 1,000, 1,200 feet underground. You have to pull that water up. There's water in the canals that can simply be dumped into these canals. And there's reuse water, where you take sewer water from the Miami-Dade area, clean it, and use that water into the cooling canals. So Turkey Point is trying to use all types of water in order to rehydrate their own cooling canals. If you think about it, in 1972, when the plant was built, you had miles of cooling canals, and every single day the water evaporates, leaving the salt behind. And that salt gets heavier and heavier. The salt water gets heavier and heavier, and it sinks through our porous rock until it hits bedrock. And once it hits bedrock, it then goes left and right in a plume out toward Biscayne Bay and landward toward our drinking water wells. In the Florida Keys, we get our drinking water from a series of pumps and wells near Florida City. Well, this plume that has left the plant has pushed the salt water toward our drinking wells, and it is about 4 miles away from our drinking wells now. And this saltwater intrusion is nothing new. The saltwater has been moving landward for decades, and that ties back into the same water system we just talked about. The water system in Florida is really a dynamic process. You have the fresh water that leaves Lake Okeechobee and the fresh water that's underground. It's all going from the land to the sea. You have the seawater pushing inward to the land. When both types of water are equal, the water stays right along the shoreline where it belongs. When the pressure from the land relents, the seawater advances. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing it for a variety of reasons. One, the starvation of water coming from Lake Okeechobee. And two, this saltwater plume that is leaving FPNL and dragging the salt water towards our drinking water wells. Now, this is happening at a very slow rate. We've been monitoring it for decades. At the rate it's going, it will probably be another 2 decades before it actually gets to our drinking water wells. But at the trend it is going, it will happen. So we either need to stop the trend, stop the march landward, or even move our wells, or be prepared to triple the amount it costs us to prepare the water, because we'll have to take the salt out of the water before it's suitable for drinking. All of these are expensive solutions. The other problem is the saltwater plume that's going eastward towards Biscayne Bay. Biscayne Bay National Park is concerned because the bay can only be so salty. If it's too salty, once again, you have seagrass die-offs. If it's not salty enough, it turns into a freshwater environment, and that harms the fish. So it has to be the right balance between saltwater and freshwater, like it was in the 16, 17, and 1800s. So the goal, again, is to try to recreate what happened in nature. In the news lately, there's been lots of stories about FPNL's nuclear power plant leaking nuclear waste into the water, either the drinking water or Biscayne Bay. And what they're concerned about is this isotope called tritium. And tritium is a hydrogen-based isotope. And even though those water systems I just described are separate and distinct, and the first two are closed, this isotope, tritium, is able to migrate from one system to another. The good news is it is not all that harmful at the levels it is at. The national drinking water standards allow 20,000 parts per liter of tritium in drinking water, 20,000 parts. In the cooling canals, which is the worst area, it's 16,000 parts. Out in the bay, it's 20. So the drinking water standards are 20,000, and in the bay, it's 20. In the background area, about 4 miles from the plant, it's about 4 parts per unit. So we know if the power plant wasn't there, the Biscayne Bay should be about 4 parts of tritium per unit. Instead, it's 20. So that is proof, if you will, that the water in those cooling canals is leaving the cooling canals and entering Biscayne Bay. We've done the same monitoring wells to the west, to the drinking water, and it goes out about 4 miles where we can monitor the tritium. So we know this plume is going east and west. And even though tritium at these low levels isn't a problem, the plume is a problem, because the plume is salt water. And we don't want salt water near our drinking water wells, and we don't want salt water to create a hypersaline environment in Biscayne Bay. Both of those are a problem. When Turkey Point Power Plant was permitted in the 1970s, part of their operating permit required them not to harm the surrounding areas. The surrounding areas were supposed to be exactly the same prior to the plant being built as they were after, and that simply isn't the case. So our efforts have been to try to get Turkey Point Power Plant to keep the salt water on their property and not let the salt water migrate left and right. We've worked with the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. We've worked with the South Florida Water Management District. And right now we believe the federal agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, will probably have to get involved to protect both the drinking water portion of this as well as the Biscayne Bay portion of this. So please, if you take anything away from this presentation, know that we won't have 2- and 3-headed crocodiles crawling out of the Turkey Point Power Plant. That is not likely to happen. But the salt water is a problem. The salt water causes us problems, but the trace amount of tritium is handy because it lets us know that that particular water came from Turkey Point Power Plant. but it is not deadly in that it will cause us any problems at the rate it is today. So what does the future hold? For one, Turkey Point Power Plant has asked to build 2 new nuclear power plants out there. The 2 new plants intend to use cooling towers instead of cooling canals. It is possible that when they build the new plants, the cooling canals could go away and cooling towers could be used for the old plant as well. That is unknown at this time. But the Ocean Reef Club Board of Directors and the Orca Board of Directors has formed an environmental committee, and the environmental committee has been monitoring this for the past 4 or 5 years. Staff has been monitoring this for the past 10 years, and we will continue to do so, and we will continue to educate both the homeowners and the general public about the impacts of the power plant and how that affects our environment.